Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. We are continuing our study. I'm trying to drive home the point. I'm trying to give you more evidence than is necessary to drive home the point that when Jesus said the world mission would be completed, it would prove that the end was near. It was at hand. It was coming soon. Now, when I get through Revelation on this, all right, which is like 2 videos away, I'm going to drive this point home in an incredible way that leaves the opponents of covenant eschatology without any excuse, without any argument, without any evidence whatsoever that time statements mean nothing. You really don't want to miss this. Oh, and by the way, I've decided that due to the demand, and since I'm not finished with looking at Matthew 24:14 and the preaching of the gospel into all the world as a witness to the nations, I'm going to go ahead and extend my 2-book offer, all right, through this month. This will be a continuation. This will be the August 2019 2-book special. Regularly $41 for the month of August until I'm through with this examination of Into All the World Then Comes the End. Your total cost, $30 delivered to your door. So, back by popular demand, as the saying goes. Now, I want you to notice that this preaching of the gospel into all the world as a sign of the parousia. Now, mind you, once again, it's critical to see that the disciples did not ask about 3 totally distinct, separate events. As I've shared with you, Mr. Sam Frost says that Matthew chapter 24 verse 3 needs to be broken down like this. Tell us, when shall these things be? That's the fall of Jerusalem and the temple. That's one event. And your parousia, that supposedly is Jesus' ascension of Acts chapter 1. So the disciples were ostensibly asking, what's the sign of your ascension? Wow. That's an unheard of argument. I mean, that's just basically unprecedented. And then thirdly, they're asking about the end of the age, or what Mr. Frost calls in his book, the annihilation of the world, which is not a biblical doctrine. But you see, Jesus gave the completion of the Great Commission as the sign of his coming and the end of the age. It was to be a sign of his coming in Matthew chapter 24, 29 and 31. Well, Matthew 24, 29 to 31 is his coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory to gather together the elect, which is at the end of the age. Matthew chapter 13. So they were not asking about Christ's coming, actually his going into heaven of Acts chapter 1. They were asking about his coming in judgment at the end of the age, which is precisely what they asked about. Pardon me. Allergies are bad. Anyway, here's to follow up on what we've been looking at. The disciples asked about the end of the age. In 1 Peter, boy, this is powerful. I mean, this is powerful. And look, I got to tell you, I'm skipping over a ton of stuff. All right? But keep in mind that Peter is written during the period of time that Paul said the gospel had been preached into all the world, to all of the nations. And skipping over some verses in 1 Peter chapter 4, Peter said, the end of all things has drawn near. Now, it's absolutely stunning to me that Mr. Frost says 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 7 qualifies the end of the ages with the expression, the end of all things. The ends, plural, of the ages have drawn upon the world, perfect tense. Peter is not saying the end without qualification was at hand. That is, the end when the gospel had been published among the nations as a testimony. Well, that's a blatant falsehood. Paul, in Romans, in Colossians, said the gospel had been preached into all the world. Now, did you notice the subtlety of the shift? And I know that tomorrow is supposed to be when I address his book, but I've just got to take note of this. Did you notice that Mr. Frost does an extremely subtle shift? And he says, Peter uses a neuter plural, or Paul uses a neuter plural, ends. And it denotes the whole, or the fullness without at all touching the duration of such. Well, yes, it does. The ends of the ages has come upon us. There's your qualifier. There's your qualifier of time. The time had arrived. Then, on 1 Peter 4:7, he says, this qualifies the end of the ages with the expression, the end of all ages, of all things, The ends, plural, of the ages have drawn upon the world. Folks, that is not what Peter said. Mr. Frost argues that the end, singular, is the consummative end. Well, guess what? In 1 Peter 4 and verse 7, in the Greek, it is ho telos singular. Oh, and Mr. Frost tells us it qualifies the end of the ages with the expression. Now, he says the end of the ages is qualified with the expression, the end of all things. Where is it qualified? Where is it qualified that it's not the end of all things? These are word games. And they're wrong. Peter was expressing unequivocally, affirmatively, undeniably, and explicitly the singular, end singular of all things. Now, notice that he says, Ponton de to. Of all things, the end has drawn near. Mr. Frost wants us to deny that the end of the ages and the end of the age had drawn near. Where's the qualifier? It's not there. Jesus said the gospel would be preached in all the world as a witness to the nations. Then comes the end. The end of the age. You know, here's this statement. And we must take it, once again, in light of Paul's repeated affirmations that the gospel had been preached into all the world. And here's Peter, writing in that same time frame, says, the end, singular, of all things has drawn near. Now, again, I'm ignoring for this discussion, because of time constraints, of how comprehensive this statement is. How it interrelates and conflates perfectly with Jesus' statement in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 14. This gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to the nations. Then comes the end. And here is Peter writing when Paul has said the gospel had been preached in all the world, saying, or then the end would come. And Peter says, the end of all things has drawn near. Peter is commenting on Matthew 24:14, directly echoing it. And that means that when he said in 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 17, the time, literally the appointed time, the divinely appointed time, has come for the judgment. Not a judgment, the judgment. What judgment is that? Oh, it's the judgment of the living and the dead of 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 5. This is undeniable. Absolutely undeniable. And it means, number one, the gospel had been preached into all of the world as a witness to the nations, or else Peter was simply wrong to say the end has drawn near.